Hey everyone, it's your guy here, back with another no bullshit deep dive into what's really happening out there. And let me tell you, this one is absolutely loaded. So grab a coffee, settle in, because we've got a lot to unpack. And I'm not leaving anything on the table. Let's rewind to the very beginning of this Iran conflict. U.S. Defense Secretary Hegseth stood up and said something that every single American should have felt in their bones. He said, and I quote, "If you spill American blood or threaten any of our people anywhere on this planet, we will find you, no hesitation, no mercy, and we will take you out." That wasn't just rhetoric for the cameras. That wasn't political theater. That was a promise, a vow, a commitment from the highest levels of our military leadership. That was a message sent directly to every enemy of the United States, from Tehran to Pyongyang, that American lives are not negotiable. And fast forward to right now, that promise has become a brutal, bloody, undeniable reality. After Iran launched its latest barrage of attacks, a U.S. base in Jordan took a direct, devastating hit. 3 of our soldiers were killed. 3 American families just got a knock on the door that no one ever wants to answer. 3 mothers, 3 fathers, 3 sets of siblings now have an empty chair at their dinner table. 3 Gold Star families who will never be the same. 4 more of our people were wounded. Some of them critically fighting for their lives in field hospitals as we speak, with surgeons working around the clock to save them. And as if that wasn't bad enough, around the exact same time up in northern Iraq, another American serviceman was doing his job, inspecting the wreckage of a downed Iranian drone when an unexploded ordnance tore him apart. Just like that, another life gone, another flag-draped coffin heading back to Dover Air Force Base, another solemn ceremony at Arlington, another family left to wonder why. Those 4 deaths mark the very first combat casualties for U.S. forces since Washington and Tehran signed that so-called Memorandum of Understanding. That's a fact that should give every American pause, because it tells us that the so-called peace was nothing more than a mirage. Now, at the time that memo was signed, most folks on the outside, analysts, pundits, the talking heads on cable news, they all figured we were heading into a chill period. Let the suits and the diplomats hash out the boring but critical stuff over mahogany tables in Geneva or Vienna. No more shooting, no more dying. No more flag-draped coffins. The conventional wisdom was that both sides had gotten what they wanted and were ready to step back from the brink. The optimists said we had turned a corner. The pessimists, well, they turned out to be right, because that's not how this works. That's not how the world actually operates. Because with 4 American lives snuffed out, Uncle Sam didn't waste a single second. Retaliatory airstrikes lit up the night skies like the 4th of July, and behind closed doors, U.S. officials told the Washington Post that D.C. is now gearing up for something way, way bigger. So here's the million-dollar question that everyone's asking. From the Pentagon to the White House to every kitchen table in America, didn't we just sign a peace deal with Iran? How the hell are we back at each other's throats already? And is America truly, genuinely ready for a fight that could spiral into a full-blown regional war that drags in half the Middle East and sends shockwaves through the entire global economy? Let's cut through all the noise, all the spin, all the diplomatic doublespeak that comes out of foggy bottom briefings. At its core, this ain't rocket science. This is about one thing and one thing only: oil, black gold, the lifeblood of the modern world. The stuff that keeps our cars running, our lights on, our factories humming, our planes flying. But here's the twist this time: it's not about who's sitting on more crude reserves. It's not about who has the bigger oil fields or the longer pipelines. It's about who holds the choke chain on the world's energy jugular. And that choke chain is called the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow strip of water, just 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, carries about 20% of the world's petroleum. 20%. Let that sink in for a moment. That's millions of barrels of oil every single day flowing through a waterway that you could practically swim across. Early on in this conflict, Iran slammed the door on that waterway. They blockaded it, shut it down, and tried to jack up global oil prices to astronomical levels. Their goal was simple: squeeze America's Gulf allies until they screamed, squeeze Europe until they buckled, squeeze every nation on earth that depends on Middle Eastern oil, and force all of them to beg Washington to stand down. It was economic warfare, pure and simple, and it was devastatingly effective. And you know what? That pressure tactic actually worked, at least in the short term. It cooked up that memorandum, and a whole lot of observers around the world called that a straight-up win for Tehran. Not only did Iran get sanctions relief real tangible, meaningful relief, and a bunch of frozen assets unlocked, we're talking billions of dollars here, But in their own reading of the deal, it also handed them the keys to the kingdom, meaning effective control over Hormuz itself. They interpreted that memo as a green light to do whatever they wanted. And Iran wasted absolutely zero time flaunting that control. The moment the memo was signed, they started throwing their weight around like they owned the place. They noticed commercial ships tipped off by the US starting to sneak through international lanes closer to Oman's coast, lanes that put them out of Iran's direct reach. So what did Tehran do? They started blasting those very ships. They attacked tankers, cargo vessels, anything that moved through those alternative routes. They launched missiles, deployed fast attack boats, and even used drones to harass commercial traffic. They made the Persian Gulf a shooting gallery, a no-go zone for international shipping. And soon enough, more and more shipping companies flat out refused to transit Hormuz at all. They said, forget it, it's not worth the risk. We're not sending our crews into a shooting gallery. Insurance premiums skyrocketed, crews refused to sail, and global shipping ground to a halt. And that is a nightmare scenario for America. We need that strait wide open, not just for our own energy security, but to keep global markets from going absolutely haywire. When traffic eventually resumed after the initial blockade, Brent crude even dipped back to around $72 a barrel, which was basically pre-war levels. But now, with tit-for-tat airstrikes escalating by the day, oil is creeping right back toward $100 a barrel. And for most countries on this planet, that's a gut punch they can barely afford. They're still reeling from the last energy shock that sent inflation through the roof, hammered working families, and made everything from groceries to gasoline more expensive. But Iran, they're feeling it a lot less. Even the US naval blockade, which we reimposed with full force, didn't bite as hard as we might have expected. Why? Because Iran got smart. They adapted, they found workarounds according to the Wall Street Journal during about a month of relative calm, that window when the memo was supposedly holding. Iran rushed to ship out roughly 70 million barrels of crude. That's 70 million, let that number sink in. That's enough oil to fill a supertanker fleet that would stretch for miles, enough to power entire nations for weeks. And they raked in somewhere between $5 and $6 billion in hard currency. That's billion with a B. But it wasn't just about the cash, although that's a whole lot of cash. Before that, the blockade had left so much oil sitting on shore in massive storage tanks and floating on supertankers that even Iran's biggest export hub, Kharg Island, was completely maxed out on storage capacity. They literally had nowhere left to put the stuff. Tankers were queued up like cars in a traffic jam, just sitting there vulnerable to attack, vulnerable to sabotage. If they hadn't sold, they'd have been forced to shut down wells. And once you cap a well, restarting it costs a fortune and kills future output for years, sometimes permanently damaging the reservoir. So that 1 month pause was absolute gold for Tehran. It cleared their storage tanks, it filled their war chest, and it allowed them to replenish all the drones' missiles. And other military gear they'd burned through in the earlier phases of the fighting, they used that pause to reload, plain and simple, and they did it right under our noses. They played us, and they played us well. Now, don't think for a second that Washington didn't see this coming from a mile away. Of course we did. We have satellites, we have intelligence, we have analysts who track every single tanker movement. We knew Iran would use any ceasefire, any lull in the action to rearm and resupply. And to some extent, we let it slide, because keeping Hormuz flowing and oil prices in check was a price we were willing to pay, at least for a while. We made a calculated decision, we weighed the risks and benefits, but here's the red line, the line that America will never ever tolerate, the line that cannot be crossed under any circumstances. Iran, using brute military force to lock down that strait for good. If they get that grip, if they establish permanent, unchallenged control over Hormuz, they own the world's energy lifeline. That gives them leverage over every major economy on Earth, including ours, and that is a national security threat we cannot stomach, we cannot ignore, and we cannot negotiate away. That's a threat to our way of life. And that's exactly why the cycle cranked right back up. Airstrikes, retaliation, more airstrikes, more retaliation. Over the past week or so, the US has hammered Iranian targets left, right? And center, we're talking coastal surveillance radar, air defense systems, missile and drone storage depots, plus naval facilities that were directly linked to those attacks on commercial shipping. Bandar Abbas, Iran's biggest naval base, right next to the Strait of Hormuz, has taken some of the heaviest hits. Tehran claims at least 46 people are dead, over 400 wounded. And you can bet your bottom dollar those numbers are climbing as the strikes keep coming, because we're not done yet, we're just getting started. Beyond military sites, Iran is now accusing the US of going after civilian infrastructure. That's a serious charge. And it's one that plays well in the international media. They say our strikes have hit train stations, residential neighborhoods, bridges, water treatment plants, and grain storage depots. The medical sector got slammed too. Bakiatala Hospital was knocked out of action, forcing more than 200 patients to evacuate, including some in critical condition who were on life support. Iran also claims a seawater desalination plant was destroyed, leaving over 10,000 people without drinking water in the middle of a brutal summer heatwave. Now, the US denies that flat-out White House spokespeople insist every single target was military in nature, and they say any civilian damage was either accidental or caused by Iranian air defense systems misfiring and falling back on their own cities. But multiple media outlets, including the BBC, have done their own on-the-ground verification and confirmed that some civilian facilities did indeed get damaged. So where does the truth lie? In war, it's always murky, always contested, always used as propaganda by both sides. But the perception alone is dangerous, because perception becomes reality for millions of people, and that perception can fuel anti-American sentiment for generations. So why would we hit those kinds of places, assuming it was intentional? A lot of analysts figure the Trump administration is trying to cut off Iran's military from dual-use infrastructure. Stuff that serves civilians on the surface, but also keeps the regime's war machine humming. A power plant generates electricity for homes, but it also powers radar systems. A water treatment plant serves neighborhoods, but it also supports military bases. A grain depot feeds the population, but it also feeds the Revolutionary Guard. Another theory floating around DC is that Washington wants to turn ordinary Iranians against their regime by making daily life even more miserable. The logic is that if we bomb their water, their hospitals, their grain supplies, they'll take to the streets and demand the regime surrender. It's a pressure cooker strategy designed to break the regime's grip on power. But here's the kicker: that strategy could backfire in the most spectacular way imaginable. If the US keeps pounding civilian sites, it might just push those same Iranians who already deeply dislike their government to rally around the flag instead of against it. Patriotism is a hell of a drug, especially when your country is under attack from the outside. Trump's dream of an internal uprising might never materialize, and we could end up strengthening the very regime we're trying to weaken. That would be the ultimate irony. Let's rewind a bit for some context, because this is important, and it tells you a lot about how we got here. Before this all blew up, Trump was all about positioning America as Iran's best friend. I know it sounds crazy, but that was the narrative they were pushing. Back in January, when protests were raging across Iran, he went public saying the US would help Iranians break free from their oppressive leadership. He demanded Tehran stop executing demonstrators and even claimed his pressure campaign had saved over 800 political prisoners from the gallows. That's a bold claim. And honestly, it's hard to verify with Iran's information blackout. It's tough to gauge exactly how that played on the ground. But from some Iranian reactions we've been able to capture through social media and rare interviews, plenty of people felt burned. One Tehran resident told ABC that Trump promised to topple the regime, then left them with a wounded, crazy, and even more dangerous version of it. That's a direct quote if more Iranians come to believe that we're deliberately bombing their hospitals, schools, and water systems, making their already brutal lives even worse. That sense of betrayal will only fester and turn into outright, burning hostility toward America. And that's exactly what Iran's leadership wants. They thrive on anti-American sentiment. And of course, Iran is now using our airstrikes as their own excuse to hit civilian infrastructure. On July 11th, they launched missiles at a power plant and desalination facility in Kuwait, crippling a key water source for that country. For Kuwait, that's not just any target. Nearly 47% of its annual fresh water, about 1.7 billion cubic meters, comes from desalination. Knock that out, and you've got a full-blown humanitarian crisis on your hands. But the most desal-dependent U.S. ally in the Gulf is actually Qatar at roughly 61%, followed by Bahrain at 59%. Iran has previously struck Bahrain's desal plants and has also hit multiple targets inside Qatar. So far, they haven't gone after Qatar's facilities again in this round, but nobody in their right mind is betting they won't. This is straight out of Iran's playbook from the war's early days. Attack critical infrastructure in Gulf states, stir up chaos and panic among local populations, and let those angry citizens blame the US and Israel for dragging them into the fire. It's a classic asymmetrical warfare tactic. A few months ago, Both sides treated desal plants and other civilian utilities as off-limits. They were understood to be protected targets. Now they're on the menu, proof that things have gotten dangerously ugly, even if the current airstrikes aren't as ferocious as March's massive onslaught. The fact that both sides are now openly eyeballing civilian infrastructure is a terrifying escalation that could have consequences for decades to come, both humanitarian and strategic. So, is America truly ready for the next phase of this war? As it stands right now, that memorandum is pretty much dead in the water. It's a scrap of paper with no meaning, no weight, no credibility. Iran's Supreme Leader Khamenei put out a blistering statement calling Trump's signature absolutely worthless, saying the US broke the deal first and can't be trusted for a second. Trump fired right back with his usual bravado, brushing off Iran's complaints and doubling down with a renewed naval blockade and relentless airstrikes. All signs point to one thing: the risk of all-out war between the US and Iran is spiking fast, and both sides are bulking up for round two in a serious, no-holds-barred way. We're talking about a potential conflict that could dwarf everything we've seen so far. I mentioned earlier that Iran hit that Jordan base and killed 3 of our guys. But here's the thing. Since the conflict reignited, Jordan has become a prime target for Tehran. The New York Times quoted US officials saying Iran launched 4 separate attacks on Jordan in just 5 days. That's a pretty intense tempo, especially given the smorgasbord of other targets available across the Gulf. So why Jordan? Why are they getting singled out? Because even though they claim neutrality on paper, they've quietly let the US use Mulfaq Salty Air Base and other facilities to stage operations against Iran in Tehran's eyes. That's anything but neutral. That makes them a legitimate target in Iran's view. Meanwhile, plenty of other Middle Eastern nations, places like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, even Qatar, are restricting US access to their bases and airspace, which makes Jordan even more strategically valuable to us. Add in that Jordan has repeatedly helped Israel intercept Iranian missiles, and you can see exactly why Iran's pissed off. Hitting Jordan is both payback for past cooperation and a clear warning shot to every country backing America: help us and you'll pay the price. It's a message of deterrence, plain and simple. But there's a deeper military logic here beyond just revenge. This is about strategy early in the war. Iran successfully destroyed an ANI-TPY-2 long-range radar in Jordan, the eyes and ears for the THAAD missile defense system. At that base, that was a massive loss for the US, Israel, and Jordan, since all 3 relied on that radar to track incoming Iranian missiles in real time. The US scrambled to find a replacement, and it hurt our defensive posture significantly. Now Iran is hammering that same airbase again, clearly trying to gut US and allied air defenses before a full-blown war erupts. And they're not stopping at Jordan. Iran has also announced strikes on Kuwait's Ali Al Salem Air Base, air defense radars, and US munition depots at Camp Arifjan. This is a systematic, calculated campaign to blind us and weaken our ability to respond effectively. They're knocking out our eyes in the sky, our communication nodes, our supply chains, beyond degrading our defenses. Iran has activated its most important regional proxy, Yemen's Houthi militia. Tehran has ordered them to seal off the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. The moment the US hits Iranian energy infrastructure, Reuters cites regional sources saying the Houthis have already positioned missiles and drones in the mountains overlooking Hodeidah and the Gulf of Aden. They're locked, loaded, and just waiting for the green light from Tehran. Sure, Bab el-Mandeb isn't as critical as Hormuz, but about 5% of global oil still flows through there. If both straits get choked off simultaneously, oil prices could skyrocket right back to wartime peaks. And that would be a global economic crisis. Exactly what Iran wants. And thanks to that 1-month pause, they've already sold off a ton of crude, pocketed billions in hard currency, and freed up storage space. So they figure their oil sector can weather a long fight. And they've got enough cash on hand to sustain military operations for a considerable amount of time. They're not going to run out of money anytime soon. But America isn't sitting on its hands either. Washington Post sources say the administration is now actively prepping for a prolonged, high-intensity conflict. The naval blockade is back in full force. Airstrikes are systematically pounding Iranian military infrastructure, and we've sent dozens more aerial tankers to Israel to extend their operational reach and keep their air force in the fight. According to Exos, Trump is reviewing multiple new military options, with final decisions pending in the coming days. Still, even with all this escalation, there is deep worry inside DC about dwindling inventories of interceptor missiles and precision-guided munitions. That could seriously cramp our staying power in a long war. More and more analysts think Iran's ability to pierce U.S. air defenses is improving steadily, leaving Washington with a brutal choice: keep burning through increasingly scarce interceptors, or pull back and let Iran claim a strategic victory. Neither option is good. Neither option is easy if the U.S. eventually opts to de-escalate. And that's a big if, a really big if. There is a Qatari mediation plan currently on the table. It proposes setting up a new designated shipping lane in Hormuz, suspending 2 other routes to lower direct confrontation risks, and creating space for fresh negotiations. As a sweetener, Qatar would help unfreeze another $1.3 billion in Iranian assets. That's certainly tempting for cash-starved Iran, but word on the street is they've already turned it down flat. They rejected it. That rejection makes a full-blown, high-intensity war even more likely in the near term. The diplomatic window is closing. Nobody in their right mind wants to go there. War is hell, and we've seen enough of it in Iraq and Afghanistan to last a lifetime. But if this conflict has shown us anything, it's that every so-called peace is just a brief pause before the next explosion. Will we tip into all-out, high-intensity warfare? At this point, no one can say for sure. What is absolutely certain, though, is that the Middle East is still miles away from any real, lasting stability. And America is going to be right in the middle of it, whether we like it or not. Our interests are on the line, our allies are under threat, and our soldiers are in harm's way. We have to be smart, we have to be tough, and we have to be ready for whatever comes next. All right, that's it for today. Stay sharp, keep your eyes open, question everything you hear from both sides, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care of each other.